Hi, we continue today in Revelation 15 and complete the unit that began in 14:1-5 in the chiastic shape that you see on the right side of the screen, so matching the part at the beginning 14:1-5 is the part we began last video 15:1-8. And last time we focused on the Song of Moses and Song of the Lamb, which was a mystery for scholars because the Song of Moses, normally understood as incarnate in Exodus 15, is not really echoed in Revelation 15:3 and 4, and so that led scholars on a chase for what does he mean by that. And as I tried to show last time, although Revelation 15:3 and 4 is a mosaic, as so much of Revelation is passages from Hebrew Scripture, the Song of Moses here implies the entire story of Moses in contrast and in comparison with the story of the Lamb. So as we saw last time, the covenant curses in Deuteronomy 28 and in Leviticus 26 spoken according to the Torah in the mouth of Moses, or at least transmitted in the mouth of Yahweh through Moses in Leviticus 26. That's part of the Song of Moses, which is to say not just the literal song in Exodus 15, but the story of a God who called people out of slavery in Exodus, but then warned them not to act the way the Egyptians did, lest the diseases of Egypt come back upon them, which is what we saw in the covenant curses. So today we're picking up the second half of this in verse 5-8, and although it doesn't seem immediately to have as much of an Exodus echo, if we read more carefully, we'll see it. And this is a great example of what happens when one reads carefully and stays with the text. It's so easy just to jump right through some of the details and think, kind of, what's the point? Especially in our world where we're, swollen with media and all kinds of things that take up our time and would take up more of our time if we let it, and we just want to race through things. But here is a great example of what happens when we look carefully. So follow with me here, and we'll see the deep connection here and the contrast that John is making between the Jerusalem temple and the condemnation of the physical Jerusalem as a form of Babylon, the great city, and the temple of the tent of meeting we see here. So let's begin with our passage here in verse 5. After this, marking a transition there, the metatauta, a standard transition phrase, so clearly separating this piece off from what went before, and yet, as we see, still part of this chiastic structure. And what he saw there was the temple of the tent of witness in heaven was opened. Temple is used a number of times in Revelation. We're going to look at that in a second. But what's key here is the tent of witness, skene, the word for tent, which was used once earlier in 13:6, but used very importantly in 21:3 to highlight that a new Jerusalem, the alternative to Babylon that will emerge and come down out of heaven from God for the people in chapter 21, that God does not dwell in a temple but in a tent. That's the first clue of what's going on here, this reference to the tent here, and the first reference to any kind of tent since 13:6. If we go back to 13:6, we can see the context there, which was not translated as tent but as dwelling here, skene here. So the beast uttered blasphemies against God in his dwelling. But here, skene is plainly not a tent. God did not live in a tent in that story. So it's using the metaphorical sense of tent in the broader sense of dwelling. But plainly, tent of meeting in our passage is referring back to the Exodus tent. And we'll see more about that in just a second. While we're on temple, let's look at temple scenery and imagery in Revelation, and we'll see perhaps a little bit of a pattern. So I've underlined the elements that are associated with the temple. So I didn't underline pillar here, but that would be one of them. And throne here, altar here, court here, Ark of the Covenant there. So all these things associated with this temple. And of course, this is the temple in heaven, or on the other side of the veil, if you will. This is not referring specifically to the Jerusalem temple. We'll see the irony of, I will make you a pillar in the temple of my God, but at the very end, I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb. So to say you are a pillar in the temple of my God is to say you're a pillar, you're part of the construction of God's very self, according to this story. And then we saw in 11:19, God's temple in heaven was opened, and the Ark of the Covenant was seen within his temple. And that's very similar to what we see here. The temple of the tent of witness in heaven was opened. But the fact that this said the temple in heaven is open, and this distinguishes, suggests two separate things. And I can't prove that exactly, and Revelation is not so much about facts, but about imagery. And yet, I hope by the time the video is over, you'll see that it's making a subversive reference to something else. And then we see a number of other references right in our immediate past is a temple filled with smoke, and we'll look at that, both the temple and the smoke issue in a minute, and then as it sets up for what follows in the next chapter, a loud voice in the temple telling the 7 angels. So here, this is all the temple of the tent of witness in these sections, including here too. So all of this 15, 16 is the same temple. And then at the end is no temple. So in other words, the last reference to any kind of temple we see is the one we're seeing now, which is an echo of the tent of witness in the Exodus. So we'll look back at that more in just a minute. So after the temple was opened, and out of the temple came the 7 angels with the 7 plagues, robed in pure bright linen with golden sashes across their chests. There's a little logistical issue here if we think about it too hard. We saw earlier that that John had already seen the angels a couple of verses earlier, but if the tent of witness was closed and the angels were inside the tent such that they can come out now, how did John see them earlier? The only logical inference is the tent is transparent in some way, that he could see the angels inside the tent, but perhaps that's getting too logical about something that we should just understand as imagery and not worry about it too much. So the 7 angels that we saw last time come out with the 7 plagues, robed in pure bright linen. And let's look a little more closely at the issue of linen clothes in Revelation, and we'll also see something perhaps interesting there. This is the first reference to it, and I've underlined the distinctions here. Notice this uses the Greek word linon, which is from which we get the English linen, but the other passage uses businos, which is more of a form thing, to be comprised of linen. So something made of linen as a separate word, but it's implying the same substance. So we see it here coming up in the cargo hold of what is destroyed when the merchants stand at a far distance from smoking, burning Babylon and lament the loss of all this cargo. And we see the same thing here. Then, though, we see the bride, New Jerusalem, before she comes down, so to speak, but as anticipated, clothed with fine linen, bright and pure. So exactly the same as what we see here, bright, pure linen. Later, though, we see the armies of heaven with a slight difference, fine linen, white and pure. I don't think there's any major distinction between bright and white, but John does make that distinction there. So the armies of heaven and the New Jerusalem, the city itself, are clothed in that same kind of linen as the angels. And I just note here, and we'll come back to it, that the Septuagint doesn't use either linen or businos, but uses the simpler word busa, which is just another synonym for linen. Of the 40 uses in the Septuagint, 33 are in Exodus 25 to 37, which is the description of the tent of meeting. And maybe you can begin to see where this is going, but we'll look a little more closer and you'll see some more details. Golden sashes around their chests. And curiously, for me at least, I thought the internet would be filled with images of angels in bright white linen with golden sashes around their chests, but I couldn't find one, either a classic one or a modern one. But there's something else going on here, too, that you can see from my note below from Exodus and Leviticus. So let's look briefly at the Exodus 28, 4-5 passage here, and we'll note where linen is found, where sashes are found there along with linen. So these are the vestments that they shall make: a breastpiece, an ephod, a robe, a checkered tunic, a turban, and a sash. When they make these sacred vestments for your brother Aaron and his sons to serve me as priests, they should use gold, blue, purple, and crimson yarns and fine linen. That's plainly the voice of Yahweh speaking to Moses about his brother Aaron, which is to say the priestly vestments include a sash made out of linen. So we're seeing the linen and sash here implying a priestly vestment. We also see a similar kind of thing in Leviticus, where we hear this, again speaking of the priest. He put the tunic on him, fastened the sash around him, clothed him with the robe, and put the ephod on him. So again, Leviticus and Exodus, like last time, Deuteronomy and Leviticus, are providing a background for both the Song of Moses, but the Exodus story that we're seeing in our passage here in Revelation. So let's continue into verse 7 and 8, and then we'll go back and fill in some other details. Then one of the 4 living creatures, we haven't seen them for a while, have we, gave the 7 angels 7 golden bowls full of the wrath of God, who lives forever and ever. And so the issue of bowls full of God's wrath comes from Isaiah. We can listen to this passage from Isaiah and what follows a couple verses later, which is certainly fitting for what we're looking at in our scene here. So from Isaiah 51:17 we hear, rouse yourself, stand up, O Jerusalem, you who have drunk at the hand of Yahweh the cup of his wrath, who have drunk to the dregs the bowl of staggering." And so there, this criticism of Jerusalem being the victim of God's wrath, as we saw last time, that sense of just because you got out of Egypt doesn't mean that you're not subject to acting like Egypt, and those are the covenant curses we saw from Deuteronomy 28 and from Leviticus 26. So Isaiah is in the same tradition as that here. But a few verses later, just down in verse 22, that was verse 17, we hear this. See, I have taken from your hand the cup of staggering. You shall drink no more from the bowl of my wrath, and I will put it into the hands of your tormentors, who have said to you, bow down that we may walk on you, and have made your back like the ground and like the street for them to walk on. So this is the reversal of what we were seeing earlier in the Exodus narrative, in the wider Exodus narrative that takes up much of the Torah after Genesis. The plagues come first, and then the liberation from Egypt, the Song of Moses follows, and then the covenant experience at Mount Sinai, and then all the provisions that we're looking at here for the priest and the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, and all those things. But here we have it in reverse. The plagues haven't happened yet, and the people are still in, God's people are still in Babylon, as we'll see, hence the call to come out of Babylon in chapter 18, although obviously some have been redeemed, those under the altar that we saw last time, and those around the altar who are celebrating, that we saw in just the last immediate scene as well. But here we see it reversed. Jerusalem had been punished with the cup of God's wrath, and now it's taken away, given to their tormentors, which is something fitting the exilic context there of 2nd Isaiah, scholars call it, also like with Jeremiah, that God was punishing Jerusalem by exile, but now God will punish Babylon, and then the Israelites will be released from exile via Persia. So that's the story that's being played out there, but it suggests that combination of exile and exodus that is throughout the book of Revelation. The phrase who lives forever and ever there, and you can also see highlighted as part of what we've seen about God's distinction from the powers that be, or the empire here, which are condemned, but God who lives forever and ever. And then continuing to our last verse, the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power. That image of from his power is unique here in Revelation, nowhere else in the Bible. And no one could enter the temple until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were ended. So smoke, the word for smoke here is kapnos, and 12 of 13 times its use in the New Testament and Revelation. Let's look at those now. And you don't see 13 because, as you see in my notes there, some of them are repeated immediately within their own context. So the purple ones are the smoke that's either from or to God, and the red is the smoke that's from the abyss or from the evil one or torturing them in one way or another. So we saw in 8:4 the smoke of the incense, which is with the prayers of the saints rose before God, but then negatively the smoke of the great furnace, which echoes a little bit from Exodus 19 in our immediate section. The smoke went up like the smoke of a kiln, like the smoke of a great furnace. And then we already saw that the coming out of the heads of the horses was fire and smoke and sulfur, which is to say they're blowing smoke. And then we saw in chapter 14 the smoke of the torment of those who worship the beast, in the contrast to what we saw in chapter 15, those who don't worship the beast or its image or its name. Now we're here our immediate passage, and then finally the smoke of Babylon's burning there. So the two positives, the one here and earlier, the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints, and the smoke of the glory of God that fills the temple here. But that is telling us something also interesting that echoes Exodus. So let's look at this passage from Exodus 40 here. Before we do that, let's look back at 1 Kings. So the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God is clearly a reference back to the beginning of Solomon's temple here in 1 Kings 8. So let's look at this from 8, 10, and 11. And when the priest came out of the holy place, a cloud filled the house of Yahweh, so that the priest could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of Yahweh filled the house of Yahweh. And so if we are hearing that, we might think a positive thing about the temple, but then we can also hear closer is this from Exodus 40, 34 to 35. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle rather. You notice how similar that is to the image from 1 Kings. We'll come back to that in a moment. Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled upon it, and the glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle. So just as in our verse 8, no one could enter the temple until the plagues were ended, Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled upon it. And so there's a lot going on here that makes us consider, is John saying something in his vision here, or the angel saying to him through the vision, something that contrasts the temple in Jerusalem with the movable Ark of the Covenant inside the tabernacle of the tent of meeting in the wilderness that takes up in Exodus 25:37. So we've seen so many links of it here. The question of filling it with smoke, the question of not being able to go in, the priestly garments of linen, the issue of the temple with the smoke here in Revelation. And all these things suggest that John is playing with a similar contrast that I laid out in my book, Come Out My People, here. And you can see this table 2 from Come Out My People, contrast the passage in 1 Kings 8 that we just looked at one verse of with the Exodus 19 and Exodus 24 issues of meeting God in the wilderness before they begin the process at the beginning of chapter 25 of following the instructions that are laid out in much detail about building the tent of meeting. And so we already saw here the question of the cloud and settling on it, and the glory of Yahweh and the people celebrating that. So this is the comparison of the glory in the temple in the wilderness. There's also in the book, I won't bring that up now, comparison of the celebration of the inauguration of the temple compared to the celebration of the covenant later in Exodus. But in all of this, I'd like to suggest, as I did in Come Out My People, that there's two different versions of the relationship between God and the people that are at issue in the Bible, and that John's vision is echoing that. One is the imperial vision, where God blesses a king on his throne, and the people come and worship the king on his throne and the royal temple, and the king supervises that through a royal priesthood. But in contrast is the wilderness, the more earthy, grounded one that we see in Exodus, and also echoes from Genesis, etc., that says God's intention for humans was to live circularly rather than hierarchically, which is to say, in a relationship with all as equals on the ground, or as we'd see in Luke's Gospel, the Sermon on the Level Place, in contrast with the Sermon on the Mount, echoing Moses in Matthew 5-7. So I can't prove that that's what John's about from this scene, but the fact that, as we've already noted today, that in chapter 21 we'll see that there is no temple in the New Jerusalem and that God is tented in their midst certainly seems to underscore that the time for royal imperial temples has passed and the time to encounter God directly through the vulnerability of a tent on the ground has come. And for those who aren't willing to receive that, the bowls will be poured out, and that's where we'll go next time. See you then. Bye-bye.